All righty. Today, it is a true privilege to welcome one of the most influential voices in contemporary critical psychology, Dr. Lucy Johnstone. Dr. Johnstone is a consultant, clinical psychologist, author, international speaker, and one of the world's leading critics of the traditional biomedical model of mental health. For decades, she has challenged the assumption that emotional suffering is best understood through psychiatric diagnoses, inviting us rather to ask deeper questions about trauma, power context, and the stories we carry. She is the co-creator alongside Professor Mary Boyle of the groundbreaking Power Threat Meaning Framework developed through the British Psychological Society as a comprehensive alternative to psychiatric diagnoses. Rather than asking what's wrong with you, the framework asks what has happened to you. It explores how power operates in our lives, the threats that emerge from those experiences, and the meanings we ultimately make of them, and the survival responses that are often mislabeled as symptoms of mental illness. Dr. Johnstone is also the author of the landmark book, Users and Abusers of Psychiatry, co-editor of Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy, Making Sense of People's Problems, co-author of A Straight Talking Introduction to the Power Threat Meaning Framework, and author of A Straight Talking Introduction to Psychiatric Diagnoses. She also led the British Psychological Society's Good Practice Guidelines on the use of psychological formulation, helping shape trauma-informed and formulation-based approaches to care across the profession. Her work has profoundly influenced clinicians, researchers, and people with lived experience across the globe by reframing psychological distress not as evidence of broken brains, but as deeply human responses to adversity, relationships, culture, and systems of power. It has become one of the most significant paradigm shifts in mental health over the past several decades. Lucy, thank you for your courage, your scholarship, and your lifelong commitment to rehumanizing mental health. It's an absolute honor to welcome you to Conversations with Dr. Wes.
Thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I'd love to dive in. I first want to say, Lucy, I've been so just grateful at the podcast that I've started back up, and I've been reaching out, and I'm a big dreamer. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to put it out to the universe and we'll see what happens. But you were one of the people that I reached to, and I was like, it's probably a long shot, but you came back and you have you've influenced my career as a psychologist, as a licensed professional counselor, and as a professor when I've taught in different master's level programs to up and coming clinicians. I'm really having to I've done a paradigm shift myself with looking at the DSM, the over medicalization, the over pathologization, but you and your work, I can put up on the screen and I can be like, let me show you guys a trailblazer in the field. And I can put up some of your talks where you start to kind of break down the power threat meaning framework and this big question of, how do we make this paradigm shift from not what is wrong to you, but what has happened to you? And one of the taglines I often use, I ran a youth center for years, and it was, you are not broken. You are not sick. You are not damaged. You are not mentally ill. You are love. You are light. You are eternal strength. And really trying to do that narrative therapeutic work of reframing how somebody sees themselves. So I'd love for you to just dive in. Tell us a little bit about yourself, for the listeners, which is a vast audience, and just kind of what has brought you here in your current work and what you're doing. That was like 9 questions.
Okay, well, I'll kick off and feel free to interrupt. I mean, thank you for letting me know that, you fund the work and the work of me and my colleagues useful, because actually America is one of the places we've found it harder to kind of get a toehold, if you like. I think the medical model is perhaps particularly strongly embedded there, partly due to your insurance system. So it's lovely to hear that it's found its way in under the radar. So as you say, I've been involved in all this a long time, and not just me, but a number of other people I count as very close colleagues and friends and allies. It's a kind of growing movement in the UK. Now, people sometimes ask me, how did you get into this? Because I've been a clinical psychologist. I trained a very, very, very long time ago, the 1980s. And I've been through various stages of my career, most of it clinical practice in adult mental health settings, some of it in training clinical psychologists, some of it in university settings. And this unexpected new stage of my career is in disseminating the power, threat, meaning framework. And how did it all start? There's a very consistent theme throughout all of that, which is I do not believe in the medical model of distress. And people quite commonly have a story of, I went into mental health systems wanting to kind of help people, and I gradually realized that this system wasn't working and I started to question it. And my story is a bit different, which is I knew this was rubbish. I just knew it was rubbish. I mean, quite literally from when I was about 11 years old, which is kind of an unhealthy thing in a way, because that's the age at which I started to kind of read psychology and psychotherapy books. So I went into clinical psychology with the same convictions, which were more than reinforced by what I saw there. And my aim was to try and do whatever I could to kind of change things. And everything that I've seen since has reinforced my belief that, yes, we've got the fundamentally wrong paradigm. And you talked about a paradigm shift. I mean, that's where we need to be. We need a change that's so radical that it's actually, completely different from what we have now. In the power, threat, meaning framework, which I'll describe in a minute, if you want it, we're not claiming to have produced a paradigm shift, but I guess what we would hope is that it's a few steps along the way to kind of pushing towards where we need to be and showing that there can be alternatives. So
yes,
that's kind of how I ended up here.
and I love, Lucy, how you kind of describe this innate internal knowing when you were younger of like, this isn't matching up for me, what society and culture is saying. And I come from a unique background. My mom has her master's in behavioral analysis. My grandmother has her EDD in psychology and from Vanderbilt, and has an interesting story. When she went to go get her PhD, they said, sorry, we don't take any women in the PhD program. You can go over to the College of Education and do an EDD. But I grew up with kind of this philosophical, psychological exploration that was not, it was critical in a certain way. And it always looked at the system with a bit of skepticism. But what is sad to me, and I want to read one of your quotes that you have that is beautiful. You say at one point, it is now easy to see how someone who has a diagnosis imposed on them can be sucked into a never-ending cycle of mental ill health and increasing lack of agency over their life, especially when mental health professionals, however well-intentioned, fail to question the diagnostic approach. And I think this touches right upon you are almost ostracized or immediately met with this defensiveness if you say, I don't believe that there's this diagnosis, or there may be a descriptor of what experience you're having as a human being, but I think you are more than just that diagnostic criteria. And that only tells us a very little bit. It does nothing to tell us the holistic part of you as a human. And so, yeah.
Absolutely, that's true. I mean, I've met plenty of opposition along the way in my career from professionals, but I mean, I've also met opposition from people who have been labelled. And, it is never my intention to strip labels off people and say you can't call yourself that. But it is my intention to open up a critical conversation. And a bit like you, one of my highest values is the ability and the commitment to thinking critically, which also goes very long way back and has roots in my own family life. I think sometimes we need kind of permission to think critically, permission to question. So it's something I've done all my life. Hasn't always made things comfortable. Questioned my school, hated everything about it, questioned my university teaching, disagreed with nearly all of it, questioned the clinical psychology training, hardly liked any of it. But if you hang on in there, I found it's possible to find things that you can believe and can commit yourself to, and you can kind of build alliances with other people. But we have been comprehensively brainwashed by the diagnostic model, and that partly applies to people who come along to services in distress, but it also applies to professionals. And as you say, it's not about blaming individual professionals. This is a systemic problem, and it's a problem that exists for reasons. And those reasons are nothing to do with evidence, nothing to do with what actually helps people, nothing to do with creating good outcomes, because all the evidence shows that by and large we are creating disability on a massive scale in mental health service. So it's about something very different, a number of very different things, I think. And once you grasp that, then I think you've got the key to thinking, what can we do instead? And of course, there's no single answer to that, but the answer is both simple and complex. I think in simple terms, we need to shift from what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Putting that into practice, of course, is not a simple matter. And if you really follow through that question, you find the thread goes from individuals to families, to institutions, to systems, to whole societies, to political contexts, to some very, very fundamental ways about, in particularly Western societies, we believe our society should be structured, and the values that we base our societies on, which I think are increasingly out of line with what any human being needs in order to thrive.
Beautifully said. And you bring up this idea of systemic, and it really is, rather than blaming individuals, we start to see the systemic functioning of this indoctrination and this brainwashing.
It is indoctrination. Yeah. I mean, it's ideologically driven, as we put it in the Power Threat Meaning framework.
Yes.
It's a set of beliefs, and they're not based on, it's a faith in a way, not based on evidence. And I have no problem with people having faiths, but you need to acknowledge it's a faith, not an evidence-based belief.
Yes.
and not try to impose it on people on the basis that this is what the evidence tells us we should be doing. So
absolutely. And it makes me, I'm so grateful for individuals like you, but also Gregory Bateson.
Yeah.
And his work, and his quote where he says, look, the problems in the world lie in the difference between how man thinks and how nature works. But there has been this attempt to compartmentalize everything. So I think about the biopsychosocial model, and this idea that we could ever really separate somebody's biochemistry or neurology from their psychology, from their social environment, from their spiritual engagement. And it makes me think a bit, Lucy, of there's a quote that says the most powerful force in the human psyche is how you describe yourself to yourself. And I think psychology doesn't really focus on that. You get sociology, you get psychology, and they want to come in and not necessarily look at, I'll give a clear example. When I was working at a psychiatric hospital and doing my internship, what I would watch happen is a young person would go and sit with the psychologist or psychiatrist and receive a diagnosis of bipolar. And then they'd come back in my psych ed group, and immediately deflated, it would encapsulate their entire identity. They would be like, I am bipolar, with no deeper understanding of how that diagnosis got created by the APA and the DSM, what it even means, and no co-collaborative approach to saying, how is this symptomology even manifesting? Why did it show up in your life? And can you recognize that this is not your entire identity? So I always like to say, if any of us went to the doctor and got a diagnosis of cancer, we wouldn't walk out and go, I am cancer. We'd say, I am dealing with this thing. What is it? How did it show up? How does it manifest? But you move to psychology and self-report and things like depression, anxiety, ADD, OCD, bipolar personality disorders. We're taught to take it on as an identity cloak, and that is who we are.
Well, it's imposed on us, yes. But and I think, there are some differences between the US and the UK. Not all psychologists in the UK would do that. Some are quite, explicitly committed to non-diagnostic practice, but a lot of them do. But I mean, it's completely unjustifiable in scientific or medical or any terms. And it's an extraordinarily powerful thing to do, to impose an identity on people. But I mean, the twist that I've seen recently, which if anything, I find even more upsetting and infuriating, is that people, often particularly young people, are actually seeking out these labels for themselves. Now that is depressing. And for someone like me who's been around for such a long time, thinking we need to get rid of these labels, and I wrote a book, Straight Talk Introduction to Psychiatric Diagnoses, in 2013, I think, the first edition, which is essentially based on the assumption that these are stigma-filled, scary labels that nobody wants, and they get them imposed on them. By the time I did the second edition in 2022, they turned into desirable commodities to be added to your Facebook profile.
And I see it all.
What the hell's going on here? This is ridiculous.
My take is, I've worked with youth, and that's been my calling. And I did what's called radical youth work, and I had these incredible mentors, ran a center. But you're right, I would see a continual over-identification and romanticization of particular mental health diagnoses as a way to find self-worth. And on TikTok and Instagram, it became rampant. And now more than anything, I've seen many people, my oldest daughter has autism and a genetic deletion and different sensory challenges, and she's beautiful and kaleidoscopic and multiplistic in her views. But I've seen more young people today cling to a diagnosis of autism that, in my opinion, they're not experiencing, but are grasping at either a personality disorder, a dissociative identity disorder, as a way to fit in a particular social group and have more self-worth. And that's a hard conversation to have with a young person and help them unpack, but nobody's doing it.
No, I mean, a few people are doing it, and some people are doing it with the aid of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, but mostly people aren't. No, but you're right. I mean, I'm probably going to make a few rather sweeping, definitive statements during our discussion, but obviously, as I'm talking to a young person, or indeed anyone, I wouldn't be going in saying, why are you calling yourself this? That's ridiculous. Because I think, these labels are performing very important functions for people, aren't they? Particularly people who feel kind of lost and confused, as is quite common for young people, but as I think is probably more common due to a lot of particularly modern social pressures that certainly I didn't have to face when I was growing up. So my colleague Mary Boyle has this very useful phrase, which she calls the brain or blame dilemma. So what she means by that is we seem to have two very simplistic, polarized ways of thinking about our struggles. Either it's our brain, it's my autism, it's my bipolar disorder, thank goodness, it's not my fault, I don't have to feel so useless, such a failure. Or it seems like the only alternative is to feel ashamed and guilty and a failure and useless and, lots of things that nobody would want to feel. It's like we don't have a middle ground. So the middle ground, obviously, is to create what I would call a narrative-based approach, which is let's understand the story about how you came to feel so bad about yourself, and let's say there's a different way of acknowledging that these are very real experiences of distress, but they can be seen as understandable in the context in which you're struggling to survive.
Yes.
So that middle ground is where, well, two things. Partly it's where the Power Threat Meaning Framework lies. So that'd be the way of having a conversation face to face. It'd be about exploring it. Let's think about this, because I mean, to be honest, if I thought there were only two options, brain or blame, I'd probably go for the brain one. But we need to open that up. But there's a practice in before the Power Threat Meaning Framework took up all my time. There's a practice in the UK clinical psychology profession, which is called formulation, which I think to some extent you have in America, but nowhere is it as deeply embedded as it is in clinical psychology in the UK. It's the absolute core of our professional skills. And I spent a lot of my career training in it, writing it, developing guidelines, researching, so on. Essentially, it's about sitting down with a person and co-creating a story about how they came to feel this way and in what context. So it's a kind of personal hypothesis, if you want to be fancy about it, or it's a kind of personal story to which the person you're working with brings their experience and the meanings and the sense they make of it. And I, as a clinician, would bring my clinical experience, but also, I hope, kind of knowledge about the impact of trauma, adversity, and so on. You put those things together, you can create or co-create what you could call an evidence-based story, which can actually be a really, really, really helpful way forward. And it's not many people know this outside the UK. People are always astonished when I say it, but actually formulation-based practices, you can find it everywhere in UK mental health services, but most people don't know how to ask for it. And psychologists have long waiting lists. So it kind of varies very much, but we actually have a live alternative to diagnostic practice. And in our national health system, which is what most people use, it is highly respectable. You know, you can say, I've said all my life, my practice is formulation based. So there we are. That's one among many alternatives. We don't have to do it this way. There are different ways of doing it.
And Lucy, I'm just so grateful you said that. It makes me think, and I want to get into the power threat meaning framework here in a minute, but it makes me think we're all doing formulation-based practices. It's either unconscious
we are
or conscious, because when you go to particular neuropsychologist or clinical psychologist, we're all formulating narratives about who you are in your life and identity and meaning and all of those things. But I like the idea of a conscious, co-collaborative, formulation-based, ethical, integrity-based practice where you are sitting with another human soul. It's like Carl Jung said, know all the theories, understand everything, study the human psyche, and as soon as you enter the room with another human soul, know that it's you and another human soul, and there is something more powerful at play that is not fully conscious to any of us, but that respect and dignity. And then I want to tell one quick story. A mentor of mine told me, and it was, I can't remember the heritage or lineage that it came from, but it was a villager, and he's walking down a stream, and he looks over in the stream and there's a baby floating, and he jumps in, he grabs the baby and he pulls it out of the stream. He walks a little bit further and there's now 2 babies. And he jumps in, he grabs them and he pulls them out. And he walks a little bit further and there's now 3 and 4. And he keeps jumping in and pulling them out. And then at some point he has to decide, do I continue to walk downstream and pull these babies out? Or do I walk the hell up the stream and figure out why so many babies are getting in the stream? And that for me is a beautiful analogy to describe what we're seeing with anxiety, depression, substance abuse, self-harm, suicidality. The babies are in the stream, but why are they getting in there? And there's something deeper happening culturally. So I wonder if you could take some of that and segue us to the power threat meaning framework and kind of flush some of that out.
Yes. So I'm just to pick up what you said. It's true, we are all formulating in a sense, and so the strategic advantage of formulation in UK services is it sounds technical and proper, and so we're allowed to do it and make it official. But in the guidelines and everything I've written about formulation, I have also said, as you said, this is a universal human skill. We all make stories. We don't actually have to sit on a psychologist waiting list for kind of 2 years to come up with a fancy formulation, because that's what human beings do. So that does lead us into the power threat meaning framework, because the power threat meaning framework, we described it as a conceptual alternative to the diagnostic model of distress. And in its simplest possible terms, the alternative we're suggesting is narrative. So narrative would include formulation. That's a kind of narrative, but it's much, much bigger. It includes all the many, many ways that for kind of 200,000 years or more and across the globe, and before anyone ever heard about psychiatry, human beings make sense of their lives, often together with other human beings. So do interrupt me at any moment, but I'll kind of jump into the power threat meaning framework. So the power threat meaning framework is something that happened by accident, as has everything in my career, because I've never planned anything. So in 2012, I happened to be meeting with a group of other people I'd known for a very long time, a mixture of psychologists, researchers, academics, and survivors, we call them in UK, people who've been on the receiving end of psychiatric services, all known each other for decades. And we started this conversation about none of us had ever believed in the diagnostic model of distress from our clinical, research, academic, or lived experience perspective. But the question of what was an alternative look like, not let's do this particular thing instead or this do particular thing instead, because in a way we have lots of, particular ways forward which are non-diagnostic, but what would a kind of comprehensive theoretical underpinning look like if it was to replace the diagnostic model? And this turned out to be an extraordinarily difficult thing to think about, even though we'd all been kind of thinking about it in a sense our whole lives. So after this 4-hour conversation, we thought, well, let's see if we can put something down on paper. And it's purely intellectual curiosity, no other aim than that. In a way, the whole project is going to satisfy the intellectual curiosity of this rather obsessive group of people, of which I'm probably the most obsessive. And we thought, we'll do this on our own. We didn't want anyone telling us what to write, anyone telling us what to think, anyone telling us we can't say this. So we got a certain way with it, but then we discovered that, in fact, we did need some funding because we needed to meet regularly. I mean, we used a research assistant and so on and so on. So the British Psychological Society, or it's the particular division that represents clinical psychologists, kindly gave us some funding, fairly minimal funding, but nevertheless, we're very grateful for it. And so we launched into this completely unexpected 5-year project, spent about 3 years thinking, what the hell are we doing? And emerged the other end with something that is imperfect and evolving, but I think we're actually very proud of it and pleased with it. So it was launched in January 2018, and having reached the end of this exhausting and stressful and extraordinarily difficult process, by far the most intellectually challenging thing I've ever done, we thought, we weren't even bothered if anyone was going to read this damn thing. We thought they probably wouldn't. Turn out to be enormous, 465 pages long in its longest version. It's got 67 pages of references. It's not the kind of thing you necessarily pick up in a kind of airport and think this will be fun to read. But I'm going to give you a link to the website, because there's a British Psychological Society website which has the main documents, but it also has a lot of shorter, more accessible versions in video form, in podcast form, in, much more accessible versions, and a lot of examples of practice and all sorts of other stuff on there. And astonishingly, it's taken off and is now available in 7 languages. I've been all over the world talking about it, as have other members of the author team and the Power Threat Meeting Framework Committee, which has the role of kind of collating and disseminating interest in the framework. So essentially, it's about narrative, as I say, but it's about narrative in the context of power. So the biggest thing we think we've added in to the many, very good narrative-based approaches, which includes a lot of therapies, is a really strong emphasis on power in all its forms, because that, by definition, is excluded from diagnostic understandings, which locate the problem within inside the individual, or perhaps within their brain chemistry. It's actually underemphasized or omitted from quite a lot of psychotherapeutic approaches and from most of psychology. I'm not a big fan of a lot of psychology, as you've probably gathered. So kind of that's what's missing. So it's about essentially linking what may be experienced as very personal forms of distress to much wider contexts, putting the political, the small p back in, and the social back in the context of the individual. And the way we did this, now this is, everything about it is optional and adaptive. It can be adaptive. We welcome people kind of changing it and using bits of it and developing it and so on and so on. So it's not prescriptive in any way, but we essentially suggested a possible structure for narratives. And the possible structure for narratives hangs on what we've called the PTMF core questions. So the very first question is, what has happened to you? in PTMF terms, how is power operating in your life? So that includes all the kinds of power, some of which are obvious, some of which are less obvious. It includes interpersonal power, things that go on our relationships and so on. These includes economic and legal power, which can work against us, etc., etc. But it also includes, perhaps most importantly, ideological power, which is the impact of any given society and culture's norms, expectations, and standards, which is the use, often misuse, of certain ways of thinking to usually impose, social or political structures to the disadvantage of those who are already more disempowered and to the advantage of people already more powerful. So we would see the whole psychiatric system as a very good example of the use of ideological power. Essentially, it's about silencing and labeling people who are, ultimately at some level most likely to be society's casualties.
Yes.
So that's the first question. The questions do not have to, they don't go in a kind of prescribed order. They're areas to think about. But once you start thinking about power, almost everything else follows from that. So the second question is, how did it affect you in PTMF terms? What kind of threats does that pose? So that's a way of expanding. So how has this played out in your life? How has it affected your sense of relational security, your physical health, your aspirations, your beliefs about yourself? The third question is, what sense did you make of it? Or in PTMF terms, what is the meaning of these experiences? Now, obviously, meanings are central to any counsellor or therapist, but in the PTF terms, we're very concerned to trace meanings back to their origins, which are not simply within the person. Meanings don't simply spring up within someone's brains kind of independently. We derive our meanings from everything we're told about, all sorts of things: how we should be, how men should be, how women should be, what success should look like, etc., etc. And what did you have to do to survive? In other words, what threat responses are you using, which is in the territory of what we call symptoms in traditional terms. But it also includes some of the things that are not usually labelled as symptoms because they're socially desirable. In fact, they're promoted. So I would say overwork, which is something I suffer from. No one's going to kind of call me off to a psychiatric hospital and inject me for working too hard because it's highly socially valued. But I'm well aware that sometimes I'm using it as an unhealthy mechanism in my own life. And finally, we think about what are your strengths, your resources, and we pull it together into what is your story. So most of the people who are using the framework are using it on a kind of one-to-one basis because that's typically how in westernized societies people present, but it doesn't have to be used in that way. It could be used and has sometimes been used at group level, used a lot at a team level, actually, in some UK services. How can we as a team think about this person we're trying to support? It could be used at the level of a whole society. It could be used in any way people want. I'll stop there because that's kind of the essence of it, but that's essentially what we're proposing as an alternative to the diagnostic model.
And Lucy, I think it is beyond, dare I say, necessary. This is in so many ways, an epistemological and an ontological kind of needing to pull the rug out from under what has built this entire structure that has told us that these particular things, like our biochemistry is broken and we are these diagnoses. It makes me think a lot. And I've told you before, I'm such a fan of Gregory Bateson, and he describes the human hand. And he says, when you look at it, you would think it's 5 separate fingers, but really these things are interwoven and interconnected and can never be separate. And when I wrote my work on addiction, I looked at biological, psychological, sociocultural, developmental, spiritual, not as separate, but as the relationships between them and the interplay and the trans-contextual nature. But Bruce Alexander's work, The Globalization of Addiction, focuses highly on how did psychosocial disintegration from a global capitalistic societal growth space create and curate many of what we call psychological disorders and diagnoses. And
Question. Yeah, that's the
yes,
question the framework tries to answer. And you're
and
right. It's an epistemological document and problem, and so a lot of the long document is a really deep dive into the history and philosophy, which you can trace back as far as you want. You can trace the philosophical assumptions back 2,000 years, and they kind of emerge in their current form in kind of positivist understandings of distress, which is a paradigm that clearly doesn't fit. But we felt unless you pull the plant up by the roots, you're going to get a modified version of what we've already got, and we really, really didn't want to just produce a modified version of what we've already got.
that's a beautiful analogy, unless you pull it up by the roots, because I think for anybody listening, none of this is trying to say that your distress is not real. That
It's the opposite.
that the symptoms are not real. So if you do have a diagnosis, what this is trying to do is go deeper into how did this emerge and what are all the various variables at play that curated this, so that you aren't just focusing on what did my brain and my internal phenomenology do to create this thing that I'm now experiencing. It's looking at all the context and all the variables that influence who we are and how we show up in our lives. And I think it's a sovereign right to be able to sit and understand yourself at that level, and for us to be able to show clinicians and psychologists that if you're, in my opinion, if you're not doing something similar to co-collaborative narrative work with your client and a power threat meaning framework, then you are doing unethical work. That's as far as I go.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I think to the extent that you're individualizing someone's understandings, I would say that's not only unevidenced, but unhelpful, possibly it's unethical if you know you're doing it and you know it isn't helpful.
Right. Yes.
So in a sense, it's not, diagnostic understandings per se we're against, it's individualizing understandings, because it's, as I sometimes say, telling someone they're suffering from a chemical imbalance isn't a lot worse than telling them they're suffering from negative cognitions, which they've got to tweak. Do you know what I mean? So
yes.
Both those are highly problematic, but it's also true, as you say, a lot of people are working this way anyway. So we're really not saying everybody stop what you're doing and do this instead, it's much better. We're saying this, we hope, will provide extra evidence and support for people who are already working this way, and possibly extra ideas. We don't know, but if it's useful, that's fabulous. If it helps to keep us on track, then that's great.
Absolutely. And I feel like you're one of the pioneers. I mean, I'm so grateful for your work, Dr. Johnstone. And it makes me think of, just how inundated and again, indoctrinated we are. And then people don't know. They're just uneducated and uninformed. Yeah.
That's what ideological power does. You think certain things are natural, inevitable, and facts. You think these are facts about the world.
And it catches like wildfire and then just gets passed on. So I think about Dr. Joanna Moncrief's work.
I know Joanna, yes.
Okay. And she's brilliant. And for anybody that doesn't, her book, The Myth of the Chemical Cure, and looking at this narrative that is still very strong today that exists.
It was a lie. It was a lie. That actually is a lie. And we know that. And
maybe you can talk a little bit about that for people that don't know.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Joanna, because I mean we all know each other in the UK. All the critics, it's a bit incestuous.
And you know what's cool, Lucy, is growing up, I've always loved music and I make music, but my favorite artists were always in the UK. Richard Ashcroft and the Verve, Tricky, all these like unique artists. So I've always had this pull to the UK. And then I went and studied with Nora Bateson and did her Warm Data Lab in London. And I was like, you know what? I could live here. And just felt this, but I've always felt this connection and call. So it's just so cool to hear that the pioneering has been happening in that group, in that region.
Yeah. I mean, there are problems here in the UK as well, as I'm sure you know. No, so we've actually quoted some of Joanna's work in the Power Threat Meaning Framework, because Joanna Moncrief is a critical psychiatrist who has been very bravely and determinedly exposing some of the myths, you could say it, lies, I would put it, to be frank. We've been told, like, depression is caused by chemical imbalance in your brain. Now, we know it's a lie because one of the, not just an accident that many people were told this, because one of the prime defences psychiatrists came up with when faced with Joanna's extremely thorough work showing there's no evidence this is true was, well, we never believed it was true anyway. So, okay, so where did people get this apparently worldwide outbreak of delusional beliefs from? You know, where did that come from then? Tell me that. So, I mean, I think, you know, I think very similarly to her, and we're very much part of a kind of active group of people challenging mainstream narratives. She's come in for a lot of flack about that. It has not been easy for her, and I think it's probably harder for a psychiatrist to speak out than a psychologist in a way, because she's from within the profession, and I think that's very threatening to the profession. I guess what that also shows is that there are many very admirable psychiatrists who are really bravely and courageously trying to do something different. So the power threat meaning framework is often dismissed as, oh, it's psychologists fighting psychiatrists. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. It's about a way of thinking, and lots of psychologists buy into this way of thinking, which always disappoints me, and many psychiatrists don't buy into it, for which I'm always grateful.
Yes, and you know what's interesting? It brings me, Lucy, back to the systemic component, which is when you look at the trainings of, you know, going here in the States and getting a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in community counseling or psychology, or, you know, counseling in any capacity, or a PhD, most of them are following these accrediting bodies. So
Yes.
my own journey, I went and did a master's in community counseling that was accredited by KCREP, which let you become a licensed professional counselor. And then when I went to go do my doctoral work, I was looking for a program that was accredited by the APA so that I could become a quote unquote licensed psychologist, and it met all the criteria. But I interviewed for 8 different programs, and I came back and told my wife, I can't do any of that shit.
Yeah.
I was like, it's so myopic. It is so like, and I said, I'm just going to go get my freaking PhD in philosophy. And she was like, hold on, calm down. What's that one unique program that was a PhD in consciousness and society out of the University of West Georgia, transpersonal, critical, humanistic? And sure enough, I went, but it's not accredited by the APA. So I had to make that decision. What does a licensed psychologist really do that a licensed professional counselor can't, and come to grips with it? But what's embedded in that curriculum is I never heard about, in my master's program, I never once heard about R.D. Laing, Saz, and Basilia, the Italian I never heard about the anti-psychiatry movement. I never, until I got to the PhD program, and people started to regularly talk about R.D. Laing's work and the anti-psychiatry movement. And I was like, what is this? And here I am. I already have my master's, and I'm a licensed professional counselor, and an entire chunk of our history got left out because accrediting bodies are going, that's not important. You don't need to learn that. You just need to learn Adler and
tick. Probably very similar in the UK, except you probably would have a mention of the so-called anti-psychiatry movement, but in about 3 paragraphs to dismiss it. Unfortunately, people have these family blaming ideas, and now we know better.
And you know, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about just some of those figures, because I was also fortunate enough to have Dr. Bruce Levine, who's and he
personally, but
he was phenomenal. He came on and he's written some incredible work on the profession, a profession of I'm blanking on it, but he uses Spinoza's work, the philosopher Spinoza, to kind of challenge that system. And you know, when I first got into the PhD program, I was not very critical. And what it did was it really helped me lean into that. And so now, before I would ever say I'm a psychologist, I like to say I'm a critical and anti-authoritarian psychologist. And I've even heard people that I respect deeply, like Bayo Akomolafe, he calls himself a recovering psychologist.
Yeah.
And
I can understand that.
yeah,
I can understand that.
but I'd love to talk a little bit about
Can I
you
just
know,
mention something briefly? A
please.
small sign of change. One of your standard abnormal psychology textbooks in the USA, often they're set out with, they have 4 models and they trace them throughout the book and regard and examine every so-called disorder from the perspective of that model. One of the models it uses is the power threat meaning framework, and
Awesome.
it's by Jonathan Raskin. I think it's not exactly the textbook I would have written, but I think it's pretty good in that it does acknowledge the existence of alternatives and places them quite centrally in its discussion.
It's so beautiful. And what's his name again?
Jonathan Raskin, who
Awesome.
was very much involved, probably still is, in the humanistic psychology division of the APA. And I'll send you the link just in case any university that's using that textbook is going to be giving people a broader perspective than the one you got. So.
Awesome. And that's so important. And I'm just, for anybody listening, I'm going to have links to include for everything that we're kind of speaking about. And, it's so interesting. I'm just so grateful again, Dr. Johnstone, because what we have is, again, kind of in my opinion, a polarity kind of happening where you can go to the psycho-spiritual community.
Yeah.
And they'll call psychology out all freaking day, especially the spiritual community will be like, want to talk about chakras, meridians, the bioenergetic field. But where my work lies is really wanting these separate institutions and things that were seen as multidisciplinary to move from multidisciplinary to the transcontextual, to understand how they work together, how psychology is not separate from anthropology, is not separate from sociology, mind is not separate from body.
Yeah.
So figures like Dr. Bruce Lipton and his work on the biology of belief, I think that we're starting to see a bit more of what I would call a spirit science, where but what I'm so grateful for your work is it has to come from within. That's part of the reason I became a psychologist and a counselor, was I can make the most influence on changing that archaic paradigm about what mental health is and what it means to be holistically healthy. I can do it from within that system, as opposed to standing on the outskirts of it and just criticizing it. So here you are in psychiatry, in psychology, changing it from the inside out in a psychologically savvy, humanistic, subversive way, instead of just sitting back critiquing, but offering a new paradigm, a new way at understanding ourselves.
I hope so, yes. So you and I and many others have deliberately acquired a certain degree of power, haven't we? That's one way of looking at it, so that because power isn't bad in itself, obviously, so we can use it, hopefully benevolently, to bring about needed change.
Yeah. So I'd love, as we keep going here for a second, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on what is needed the most right now in terms of, we're up against a lot. Humanity, you and I could talk about artificial intelligence, the exponential growth curve of technology, screens, humanity, and our struggles. I'm just curious as what you feel like is, for anybody struggling, where they can find empowerment and kind of move towards getting more holistic help, and then just your thoughts on where we're headed as a culture and a society. I know that's a lot.
Just a few easy questions. Well, the outlook for the human race is pretty depressing at the moment, isn't it? My goodness, if the planet survives, if we narrow the focus just slightly and think about what we call mental health problems, that's what I'm more qualified to speak about, I guess, and that paradigm. One of the things I think we probably need to get to is dropping the term mental health. And I use it myself because there isn't an easy alternative, but I'm sure you'll understand when I propose the fact that there is no such thing as a mental health problem, you know, that there are people's understandable responses to circumstances, and as soon as we have this intervening concept of this happened and I felt this, that's because I have a mental health problem, then we start thinking we've got to deal with the mental health problem. Then in power threat meaning framework terms, we lose the link between the threat response and the threat, and we're talking about mental health programs in school and brainwashing here and brainwashing there and more pills to cure the mental health problem, more doctors to treat it, etc. So I guess what I would always say, because this is partly what the framework is about, is that the urgent need, I think, is always for different ways of thinking. Like everything has to follow from that. And I don't want to make it sound too kind of cognitive, because in the framework we've at least tried to indicate that we don't believe thoughts are essentially separate from emotions or from bodily feelings, but at the same time, we need a critical perspective on the ideas we've been sold. So what we need anywhere that's related to mental health, both in the services and outside services and in relation to particular people, is alternative understandings. Now, the point which I think we've reached in the UK is that we really, really need the general public to be introduced to different ways of thinking. I mean, these ideas are starting to be, it's a different conversation in the UK. These ideas are around, they're hotly contested, it's all very unpleasant, lots of it gets attacked, but the kind of debates are sort of happening, and they're not reaching everybody, but they're reaching more people. But, systems themselves are never going to change beyond a certain point. I think it's important we have people in systems trying to do their very best, which is what I did for many years, but I never expected fundamental change was going to come from within the systems. Fundamental change, I think, is always a grassroots movement, and that typically comes from what you could call consciousness raising, or a different way of, people saying, I don't believe this, and I'm not prepared to put up with this kind of nonsense, and with accepting this kind of position and being told these kind of things, and being told to kind of discount my intuition and my common sense and my knowledge and my own experience. So I think we need to reach the general public so that they know that really they should think very carefully about buying the narrative of mental health, mental illness, bipolar disorder, ADHD, drugs that are supposed to treat it, the whole lot. If people aren't turning up at services thinking, because they've been told this, that that's what they need to do, then the system's not going to have anything to work with, is it? So
yes, and you mentioned, it's massive amounts of people in distress, struggling, and thinking, okay, I'm finally at my wit's end. I need help. I'm going to go into this mental health system and its institutions and diagnostic model and medication are going to be able to help me. And although they may get some immediate relief from just the simple engagement with sitting with somebody and, curating a label and then starting to treat, it's still, like you said, embeds them in a system that is not empowering, that is not moving them towards holistic growth. I had a family reach out the other day, and I work with many different families, but one of the most underserved populations that I see is 18 to 30-year-olds struggling with a burgeoning prodromal psychoses, thought disorder, anomalous experiences, which psychiatry and psychology want to call schizophrenia, and do a very particular treatment of that. And one of the institutions or smaller organizations that I do like is called the Open Dialogue Project.
I know about Open Dialogue. Yes, I'm not trained in it, but there's a big research project been running in the UK for about 5 years, an Open Dialogue, about to report its results. So
awesome. And they were having amazing results, but it's, again, for me, we got to look at things that humanize.
Yes, absolutely.
It's the dehumanization that happens that is so hurtful to people, that reduces them to their symptomology, reduces them to their diagnoses, and takes away their humanity.
Oh, absolutely. And at the same time, it disempowers everyone around them, because they feel this is a mental health problem, I can't deal with that.
Yes.
So much of the answer is ordinary human connection again, isn't it? I'm not saying there aren't serious difficulties that need more than that, but so much of the answer is ordinary human connection.
And we're disconnected from self, from spirit, from stillness, from presence, and
and our suffering is being commodified and sold back to us. That's what happens in neoliberal societies, isn't it? I mean,
God, say that. I need to run that back. I'm going to wear that on a damn t-shirt. Our suffering is being commodified
and sold back to
us. Man, if that ain't the truth.
Yes. Well, I would refer you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Sami Tamimi. I think I may have pinched that from him. He's a child psychiatrist who's also very bravely speaking out about this stuff. And that's very much his big theme. That's what happens. People are now we suffer as a result of the pressures, which can broadly be described as arising from neoliberalism. And then we are persuaded to put that into packages, and it's commodified, and the answers are sold back to us. And if those don't work, we are told, well, there's another answer just down the road, another self-help book, another label, another therapy, another drug.
And here we are in this suffering of desire. Desiring to, get free of this thing. And one of the pieces that I like so much is this, Dr. Gabor Mate's work, which I respect. And I like where he says, look, it's the Tibetan Book of the Living and the Dying says the more you try and run from hell, the more you try and run from pain and distress, which is what we're told in our culture, that you can get away from this or alleviate this or eradicate this. But the only way out is through and understanding and sitting with. There's a beautiful poem, and I've read this before, but it was a spiritual poem by Jeff Foster, and I'll just read it really quickly because I think you'll like it. It's called Unbreakable, and it says, "You do not heal from trauma, and nobody heals you either. You simply reconnect with that sacred place in yourself that was never traumatized, never broken, never damaged in the first place. Your truest self, absolute, ever present, innocent, and free. It's not a destination. It's in you, alive and awake in the moment. Know yourself as the absolute. Let all thoughts and feelings move through you, however intense or uncomfortable. The forms pass, they always pass, and you remain. You are not broken. You are unbreakable." And
I like that.
Well, and the idea is he's not trying to sell you nothing.
No, he's not even trying to sell you therapy, is he? He's trying to.
It's just like, hey, it's in you. And it's not outside of you, and you can do it. And there are people, I believe that there are, communities, and we can support one another and we can shine our light. But really the only way we can do it is kind of what Ram Dass said, where it's like you work on yourself.
Yeah.
And then you can help others. And you help others to work on yourself, but you can't do anybody else's work. No. But you can definitely, I like to view it as an internal flame, where it's like the more you can grow that and get that internal light to kind of flourish in yourself, then you impact everything around you.
Which is a lifelong process, isn't it? It's not something you achieve, is it? It's something that you that's the journey, isn't it? The journey is the destination.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Dr. Johnstone, I'm just so grateful for you on so many levels. Anything else that you feel like I could talk to you all day, and I had this big long list of questions, but I don't want to. Maybe we can do another one of these at some point. But I would just, for people that want to get a hold of you or learn more, I'll put a ton of links below. But anything else that you want to kind of put out there?
I think we've covered a lot, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. I should have said right at the beginning, please call me Lucy. Nobody calls me Dr. Johnstone. That's just for journalists, that is, because they're impressed.
Awesome.
But I mean, don't necessarily believe what you're told is quite an important message, I think. Dare to disbelieve what you're told if it doesn't fit with your experience.
Absolutely. And be wary of what is being sold to you.
Absolutely. Watch out for being a consumer of other people's products. Yeah.
Yes.
Indeed.
Well, Lucy, I can't thank you enough. I'm so grateful for you coming on Conversations with Dr. Wes. And if we may, we'll call it to be continued, because I think we'll stay connected. And I adore your work, and I'm just so grateful to have you and your influence in everything that I'm doing.
I'd be very happy to stay in touch. Thank you for getting in touch with me in the first place. Lovely to meet you.
Awesome. Thanks.
For now then.